let's introduce our next storytellers. All right, now I have the pleasure of introducing our first mother and daughter Speak Up team, Sally Rosenberg and Rachel Rosenblatt. Sally lives nearby in the Hartford area in Glastonbury, Connecticut. She's a mom of 3, and she says she's fortunate to practice the art and science of dentistry, which I loved and I think is a really more beautiful than saying I'm a dentist, which is great, but the art and science of dentistry sounds especially lovely. Rachel currently lives in Washington, D.C., where she works in criminal justice reform and enjoys trail running and propagating plants, which I can attest is a very addictive hobby. Sally said that Yosemite National Park is by far one of her favorite places. She wrote, "With the thunderous flowing water and waterfalls, you feel the forces of nature and its power. At that moment, you realize how small we are in the world." And Rachel's favorite place that she's visited is Chiang Rai, which is a city in the mountains of Northern Ireland. And if you look it up online, you'll see it's stunning. Sounds exotic and amazing. Please welcome Sally Rosenberg and Rachel Rosenblatt to tell their story together.
During the cold months of the pandemic, visits with my mother, my 92-year-old mother, were outside. She was masked with a hat, gloves, a blanket under a heater. All I saw were her bright blue eyes, just like my daughter's.
Our visits outside during the pandemic were strained, especially in the cold, usually marked by Bubby's common refrain, "What do you want from me?" Having missed the 1918 Spanish flu by not that many years, Bubby was living through yet another historical event, and my mom and I were determined to weather it outside with her.
People would say to us, "Isn't it too cold for her to be outside?" My response was that she survived 2 years in the forest from 1943 through 1944. She's tough. That piqued my interest to relearn her story. Fortunately, there's a good amount of documentation of my mother's life. I rewatched the Steven Spielberg's 1995 video about her survival and listened to the interview made by United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2006. Both reminded me about a familiar object, a very worn leather belt that had been in her top right dresser drawer for almost 70 years. At the end of 1942, my mother, Minna Rosenberg, was 14 years old. She was escaping her second ghetto in Poland, embarking on the unknown deep into the forest nearby. As she left, her father took this worn belt and wrapped it over her coat. At the time, this belt was a means of warmth and a token of her father's love. Over time, each notch of the belt would come to represent core tenets of her life: warmth, security, support, perseverance, resourcefulness, love, and most important, family. Today, I don't leave the house without checking the weather, directions, and with the pandemic, always taking a mask. I go by car, not by foot or horse and buggy. My destination is known, hers wasn't. As my mother fled the Krasny Ghetto at the age of 14 in 1942, without time to think about the magnitude of her decision, there was no preparation, no plan, only survival. For a little history on how my mother got to be the proud owner of her father's belt and became the woman she is today. The notch of warmth, the shtetl. My mother grew up in a shtetl, which is a small village. It was in Haraduk, Poland. It had no running water or electricity and no motor vehicles. But my mother wrote and spoke about her childhood as being idyllic, filled with friends, school, peaceful Sabbath and holidays, the spirit, the ruach, the warmth, the Hamish environment, the joyous Freilich surrounding, and the familiar smells of Jewish cooking. In the fall of 1939, she was not even 11 years old, and the Soviets invaded my mother's shtetl and disrupted her humble, fulfilled life. Lazy Sabbath afternoons of playing and singing with her twin sister were gone. Now the notch of security. Inside the Haraduk ghetto, now in the fall of 1941, she was only 13 years old. Haraduk became a ghetto. with German soldiers and Polish guards surrounding them. My mother had to wear a yellow star on her coat. She was not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. Living in the ghetto meant she was forced out of her own home. The entire Jewish population of the shtetl, about 300 families, were forced to crowd into 10 to 15 houses on one side of the street. Although the living conditions were crowded and unpleasant, my mother recalls being comforted by the security of her family being together. Surviving selection and liquidation in her Haradok ghetto was accomplished by hiding in her uncle's underground bunker. My mother heard the Germans walking overhead and stayed very still. Once the Germans left, she escaped by walking all night long with her mother, father, and twin sister from the Haradok ghetto to the Krasna ghetto. Krasna was the last remaining ghetto in the area, housing all the people whose villages had been destroyed. The entire family escaped this time. The rest of the inhabitants of the Haradok ghetto were killed. My mother and her family were spared. Now the notch of support. In the Krasna ghetto, also a labor camp, my mother worked alongside her mother in and around the kitchen for the German soldiers. She described to me being hungry all the time, dreaming of food day and night. She recalled seeing the small rolls for the German soldiers, but did not even take a morsel. Her fear and strong character prevented it. She was living through hell, but considered herself lucky to have the support of an intact family. The notch of perseverance, the will to survive and escape. In late 1942, she was 14 years old. My mother experienced more horrific things than one should have had in a lifetime. She witnessed a Nazi soldier shoot a beautiful young woman just to see if she would be as beautiful dead. As Nazi power grew, she was forced to make the risky decision to flee the forest with a farmer she did not know. Her oldest brother, who was a resistance fighter, a partisan, sent a letter to the family with a local farmer. Her brother begged them to leave before the Krasna ghetto would be destroyed. She left with her middle brother. No one else from the family left the ghetto that night. Her twin sister had typhoid and was 2 weeks, so her parents stayed behind. Fast forward to March of 1943. Her family is still in Krasna. She's in the woods. The same farmer makes a second and last attempt to smuggle the rest of the family out of the ghetto. My grandmother, Bubby Esther, left that night and was reassured by her husband, my grandfather, that he would leave in short order once my mother's twin sister was better and able to make the trip. My grandmother made it out 2 days before all the inhabitants of the Krasna ghetto were shot and burned. My grandfather and my mother's twin perished March 17th, 1943, on the eve of Purim. Now for the notch of resourcefulness. My mother's fleeing of both ghettos was evidence that she had a strong will to live. But the years in the woods challenged her. She lived deep in the forest for 2 long, cold winters. She built an underground bunker in the cold weather and used twigs as a bed. She was only 15 years old, and the main source of food came from begging the local villagers in the middle of the night. The brutalities my mother experienced could have made her angry and bitter, but as anyone who has met her, they know she is neither. My mother taught me by example the importance of family. Sabbath was always together with my cousins. Holidays, we shared the preparations and the celebrations. There was homemade challah bread and more baked goods than anyone needed. Always having someone less fortunate at the table was the norm to share the warmth of our family. The family mantra was, it could always be worse, no matter how bad it was. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. They sent me to Hebrew school, dance classes, piano lessons, and sleepaway camp. They had so little, but gave it all to me. No sacrifice was too much, and that comes with the burden to keep their story alive and prove the Nazis wrong about the Jews. Now, the notch of love and family. My mother is selfless, strong, resilient, accepting, not mean or bitter. Her home was open and loving. There was room for all, always able to add another to the table. If the table had the capacity for 6 You could have 12. There was always enough chicken soup for everyone. Just add a little more hot water.
When I was little, the stretching of the chicken soup or crowded apartments weren't really sources of pride, and that there were sources of embarrassment. As I've matured, the no food waste antics have stuck and have become integral to my views on sustainability and nourishment. We used to save the neck of the chicken for Bubby, and now it goes to my mom. And typically my freezer is half filled with saved chicken bones for soup. So the trait of resourcefulness seems to be hereditary. Beyond resourcefulness, I regularly witness the qualities embedded in my Bubby's belt, in my mother, and in myself. My mom grew up next to her first cousins, who became akin to 2 additional sisters, one of which joined us today. And I grew up with a similarly small family that blurred formal familial ties. My mom and Bubby have the unique ability to make something out of nothing, such as the chicken soup, adding a piano bench to the table to seat more guests. They also know when and how to make nothing out of something, such as not letting inconveniences and hassles derail a special moment. I aspire to emulate them both daily. During one of those cold masked visits, my 92-year-old Bubby met my boyfriend for the first time. Neither people of many words, their interaction was short but sweet. Bubby even snuck in a quip that her fur-lined floral cape wouldn't suit Michael. After just that short interaction, Michael shared with me that I'm just like Bubby, drawing a direct through line between the 3 generations of strong, resourceful women.
She lived deep in the woods. We live in a house. She went to 5 years of formal education and she knows 5 languages. She took 9 years to attend college at night as she worked and raised her family. Nothing ever seemed to be too hard or too much. I went to college and grad school and only had to take care of myself. My 3 children got their preschool through 8th grade education at a Hebrew day school, followed by the privilege of high school, college, and graduate school. She had a belt. I have way too many and none like hers. Thank you.
That was wonderful, you guys. I love how you used the belt as a metaphor and talked about all the amazing characteristics of your mom and your grandmother, and your story was just such a beautiful testament to her. And it really was also making me think about how, after hearing so many stories of people who lived through so many atrocities, how different the after experience is for so many people, and how, you know, your mom took that experience to be like, we're just going to welcome everybody. We're going to, if there's 6 seats, we'll have 12 seats. And that's just really incredible. She sounds amazing. So thank you so much for sharing her with me. Also, I didn't realize it, but I was your son's teacher. I realized that. I was like, wait a minute, I know these people. And Rachel, I remember you when you were very little. So we're going to have to catch up.